This is the third and the final tape on the New Order of Barbarians. This interview by Randy Engel, director of the U.S. Coalition for Life, with Dr. Larry Dunegan, was taped on October 10th, 1991, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I think, why don't we open up with a little bit about the man whom you are talking about on these tapes, just a little profile and a little bit about his education, and particularly his relationship with the population control establishment. I think that probably was his entree into much of this information.
Yeah, Dr. Day was the chairman of the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Pittsburgh from about 1959 through 64, about that period of time. And then he left the University of Pittsburgh and went to fill the position of medical director of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America.
Mm-hmm. And he was about 1965 to 68, about that period?
Yeah, that'd be about the time, 64, 65 to about 68 or 69.
Mm-hmm.
And then he left there. I don't know specifically why. I did not know him intimately. We were, more than acquainted. I was a student, and he would seek lectures, and so he knew my name as a student and probably corrected some of my test scores and that sort of thing. Of course, I knew him as a lecturer and would stand in front of the auditorium and would, listen as he talked about diseases.
And take notes as students?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, take notes.
Okay. Well, it was interesting. This man is not as well known, I think, to our listeners, like names like Mary Calderon, Alan Guttmacher. They were both medical directors at one time or other for Planned Parenthood. But Dr. Day was not well known, and as a matter of fact, when I went back into the CEGAS archives, there was very, very little information that had his actual name on it. So he was not one of the better known of the medical directors, but I'd say he probably had the scoop on what was going on as well, if not better, than any of the others before or after he came. What was he doing? Can you describe the scene of this particular lecture, the approximate date, and what was the occasion, and then a little bit about the audience?
Oh, yeah, this was the Pittsburgh Pediatric Society holds about 4 meetings each year where we have some speaker come in and talk about medical topic related to pediatrics. And this was our spring meeting. It's always late February or early part of March. This was in March of 1969. And it was held at a restaurant called Lamont, which is
well known in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, a beautiful place. Overlooks the confluence of the Ohio, where the Ohio River forms, with the confluence of the Allegheny and the Monongahela River. Very, very pretty place. And attendance, I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 people.
Mostly physicians?
Yeah, mostly physicians, if not exclusively physicians. Predominantly pediatricians, but there would be pediatric surgeons and pediatric radiologists, other people who were involved in medical care of children, even though they might not be pediatricians as such.
And the speech was given after a meal, I presume a very nice meal, and everyone was settled down and
quite comfortable
and quite filled, and really an ideal state to absorb what was ever coming. I think that when you're listening to the tape, and he says some of the most, well, not only outrageous things, but also things that you would think a pediatrician would kind of almost jump off out of his seat at. For example, on the tapes when he mentioned the cancer cures. Mm-hmm. Now, there were probably doctors in the audience who had children, perhaps with treating a child or knowing of a child who was in need of a particular cancer cure, and to hear that they were sitting, some of these, prescriptions for or treatments for cancer were sitting over at the Rockefeller Institute, and yet, as far as I got from the tape, everyone just kind of sat there, didn't say very much. I mean, he's talking about falsifying scientific data, and everyone just kind of yawns. And how long did the speech go on?
2 hours. He spoke for over 2 hours, which was longer than most of our speakers go. And one of the interesting things, as he finished and it was getting late, he said that there's much, much more, but we could be here all night, but it's time to stop. And I think that's significant, that there was much more that we never heard. In the beginning of the presentation, I don't know whether I mentioned this on at the introduction of the first tape or not, but somewhere in the beginning of this, he said, "You will forget most or much of what I'm going to tell you tonight." And at the time, I thought, well, sure, that's true. We tend to forget. Somebody talks about it, you can forget a lot of what they say. But there is such a thing as the power of suggestion. And I can't say for sure, but I do wonder if this may not have been a suggestion when we were all full of a nice dinner and relaxed and listening.
End of an evening.
We took that suggestion and forgot, because I know a number of my colleagues who were there when I would, some years later, say, "Do you remember when Dr. Day said this, or he said that, or he said the other?" And I'd say, "Well, yeah, I kind of, is that what he said? No, I kind of remember that." But most were not very impressed, which to me was surprising because, well, he used the example of cancer cures, but he said a number of things that...
like doctors making too much money and...
Yeah, changing the image of the doctor. You're just going to be a high-paid technician rather than a professional who exercises independent judgment on behalf of his independent patient. A number of things I thought that should have been offensive and elicited a reaction from physicians because they are physicians. I was surprised at how little reaction there was to it. And then other things that I would have expected people to react to just because they were human beings. And I think most of the people at the meeting subscribe more or less to the Judeo-Christian ethic and codes of behavior. And that was violated right and left. And particularly one of my friends who I thought would be as disturbed as I was about this just sort of smiled. Wasn't disturbed at all. And I thought, gee, this is surprising.
Was part of it also because of his prominence? I mean, he was...
the authority
figure.
Yeah, I think there may be something to there. This is the authority. We sort of owe some deference here.
I mean, he couldn't possibly mean what he's saying, or there couldn't possibly be any... I mean, he's such a good guy. I've often heard that phrase. Geez, he's such a good guy. I can't believe that he'd actually... mean things.
I can only speculate about this, but I do think at the time there was an element of disbelief about all of this, thinking, oh, this was somebody's fairy tale plan, but it will never really happen because it's too outlandish. Of course, we know step by step it is indeed happening right under our feet.
Yeah. Before talking about the specific areas, I think there's a lot of benefits from this tape. One of them is when we have a good idea of what the opposition is about and the techniques he's using, then you can turn around and begin your resistance to all the types of manipulation and so forth. So I think that one of the ways I'd like to start off here is to talk about seeing that there were 4 or 5 like theme songs that he kept on repeating them over and over again. For example, this business, which I think is so important, that people fail to distinguish between the ostensible reason and the real reason. In other words, if you want someone to do something and you know that initially he'll be balky at doing that because it's against his morals or against his religious beliefs, you have to substitute another reason that will be acceptable. And then after he accepts it and it's a fait accompli, then there's just no turning back.
Right.
And
it was in that connection that he said, people don't ask the right questions.
Yeah, and also too trusting.
Too trusting.
Yeah, yeah.
And this was, as I recall, directed mostly at Americans. I had the feeling they thought Europeans maybe were skeptical and more sophisticated, but Americans are too trusting and don't ask the right questions.
Well, with regard to this kind of almost a lack of discernment, I guess that's basically what he was saying. They were easily tricked or too trusting. I think the thing that really flashed through my mind rather quickly is, for example, in schools, how quickly so-called AIDS education was introduced. And it did amaze me because if a group stated publicly that they wanted to introduce the concept of sodomy or initiate sex earlier in children, and that was the reason given, most parents, I presume, wouldn't go for that. So you have to come up with another reason. And of course, the reason for this so-called AIDS education was to protect children from this disease. But actually, as it turns out, it's really been a great boon for the homosexual network, because through various things like Project 10, they've now have access to our children from the youngest years. These programs are going on from K through 12, and I imagine into college and beyond, so that they are reaching a tremendous segment. And speaking of children, I gathered that this speaker, he kept on making the point about, old people, they're going to go by the wayside. So I presume that the emphasis for these controllers or this New World Order is really an emphasis on youth. Would that be
Absolutely, yes. Emphasis on youth. This was stated explicitly. People beyond a certain age, they're set in their ways, and you're not going to change them. They have values, they're going to stick to them. But you get to the youth, when they're young, they're pliable, you move them in the direction you want them to go. So this is absolutely correct. They're targeting the young. They figure, you old folks that don't see it our way, you're going to be dying off, or when the time comes, we're going to get rid of you. But it's the youngsters we have to mold in the impression we want.
Yeah,
right.
Which is common sense. I think most totalitarians have
now, there's something about the homosexuality, I think, to expand on. I don't think this came out on the original tape. But there was, first of all, we're going to promote homosexuality. And secondly, we recognize that it's bizarre, abnormal behavior. But this is another element in the law of the jungle. Because people are stupid enough to go along with this, aren't fit to inhabit the planet, and they'll go by the wayside. I'm not stating this precisely the way he said it, but it wasn't too far from there where there was some mention of diseases being created. And when I remember the one statement and remember the other statement, I believe that AIDS is a disease which has been created in the laboratory. And I think one purpose that AIDS serves is to get rid of the people who are so stupid as to go along with our pro-homosexual program. Let them wipe themselves out. Now it's hard for me to make clear how much of this is I'm remembering with great confidence and how much is pure speculation. But as I synthesize this, this is, I think, what happens. If you're dumb enough to be convinced by our promotion of homosexuality, you don't deserve a place, and you're going to fall by the wayside sooner or later.
Right.
To be rid of you. We'll select out the people who will survive, or those who are also smart enough not to be deluded by our propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Well, it certainly makes sense for them, and I think also this early sex initiation has the overall purpose, which I think we'll get to in depth a little later, but of the sexualization of the population. When he said on the tape, basically anything goes, I think that is what we're seeing. It's not so much that, let's say, someone may not adopt the homosexual death style for himself, but as a result of the propaganda, he certainly will be a lot more tolerant of that type of behavior too. So it's a desensitization, even for the individual who doesn't go over and accept it for himself.
With the power of propaganda, you dare not be against homosexuals, otherwise you could label homophobe. You dare not be against any of our program for women, otherwise you're a male chauvinist pig. It's like anti-Semitism. This label gets enough currency in the culture that people get shot being stuck with it.
Yeah.
So it's easier to keep quiet.
Well, another theme was this business about change. Okay. And I wanted to get to change in relationship to religion and family, but during the period when I was hearing this tape, I remember going to a mass, and they happened to have at that point dancing girls on the altar, and so when I was sitting and was getting a chance to listen to the tape, I thought, as a Catholic, that has been, if you talk about the effective change, probably the most difficulty, and the hardest thing has been to watch our traditional Mass, that which Catholics have practiced, those things which they've practiced and believed for so long. And in about that time this tape or the speech was given, which was about late 1969, everything had begun to turn over on its head, so much so that I think many people feel that now when they go into a church where there is the Novus Ordo, you're almost in a constant state of anxiety because you're not quite sure.
What am I going to encounter?
What are you going to encounter now? We're going to have you look at the little songbook. Of course, that's changed radically, and then you see, instead of brethren, you see people, or you might see something odd happening up at the up at the altar, which is now the table. And
the notion of God as eternal, and the teachings of Jesus Christ as eternal, and therefore the teachings of the Church as eternal, depends on the authority of God, and God brings about change in God's way. What this boils down to me is these people say, no, we take the place of God. We establish what will change and what will not change. So if we say homosexuality or anything is moral today, wasn't yesterday, but it is today, we have said so, therefore it's moral. And we can change tomorrow. We can make it immoral again tomorrow. And this is the usurpation of the role of God to define what the peons, what the ordinary person is supposed to believe. So the idea is that if everybody's used to change, most people aren't going to ask, well, who has decided what should be changed and how it should be changed? Most people just go along with it, like hemlines and shoe styles and that sort of thing. So it is a usurpation of the role of God. And if you read the Humanist Manifesto, somewhere early in the introductory part of it, they say human intellect is the highest good. Well, to any human being, what you call the highest good, that's your God. So to these people, human intellect, being the highest good, is God. And where does human intellect reside? Well, in the brain of one or more human beings. So these people, in effect, I don't think they would be so candid as to say so, but whether they know it or not, what they're saying is, I am God, we are God, because we decide what is moral today, what is moral tomorrow, what's going to be moral next year. We determine change.
That's right. And of course, in a nutshell, you just explained the human potential, New Age, or all the new esoteric movements that we've seen. But with regard to change, he seemed to acknowledge that there were a couple of entities which traditionally blocked this change and therefore made people resistant to constant manipulation. Mm-hmm. And of course, one of those is the family. And that would include the family, grandmothers, grandfathers, or ethnic background, and so forth. And I guess I was impressed by everything he seemed to mention, whether it was economics, whether it was music, had the overall effect of diminishing the family and enhancing the power of the state.
Right. Yeah.
That was just a constant theme. And therefore, when we're evaluating things, I think one of the things we should generally say to ourselves is, what effect does that have on family life and the family? And I think if every congressman or senator asked that question, we probably wouldn't have much action up on Capitol Hill, because almost everything coming down the pike has a fact of, disavowing, hurting the family life, and enhancing and expanding the power of government.
It has an ostensible purpose, and then it has a real purpose.
Yeah, and as a so-called helping professional, your ability to say that is really interesting. On that, the other, of course, factor is this whole factor of religion, and he was talking about basically a religion without dogma, religion that would have a little bit from all the other traditional religions, so no one would really feel uncomfortable. But actually, as he said rather condescendingly, some people need this, and if they need it, well, we'll manufacture something that they need. But of course, it can't be anything that would declare anything that they were moral absolutes or the natural law, which mean that the main target of this group of controllers, of course, was and is the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And he mentioned the Roman Catholic Church specifically.
Religion is important because it is eternal, and we, people who would follow the church, will not buy our rules about change. But if we make our own religion, we define what is religion, then we can change it as suits us. Yes, the Roman Catholic Church, I was kind of flattered sitting here as a Catholic, hearing it pointed out that the church is the one obstacle that he said we have to change that. And once the Roman Catholic Church falls, the rest of Christianity will fall easy.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed, though, that as the conversation went on, he said, now, you may think churches will stand in your way, but I would just want to tell you that they will help us.
Yes.
And he didn't say they will help us all except the Roman Catholic Church. He said they will help us.
Yes.
And unfortunately,
he was right.
he was right. Yeah, he didn't say this explicitly, but again, was one of those things the themes that came through. He really thought the use of words was real important, because he mentioned this with regard to a number of things like the Bible, how the very famous psychiatrist Miru mentioned that if you want to control people, then you control the language first, and words are weapons. He apparently knew that very well, and I think the controllers as a whole know this very well, and of course it's part of their campaign. But that little statement about words, that words will be changed. When I heard that, I thought, instead of saying altar, you say table. Instead of saying sacrifice, you say kneel. With regard to the mass, and people say, well, that's not important. Of course, what you end up with, of course, is you really know that that's very important. Otherwise, why would they bother to change it?
Exactly.
Why go through all this rigmarole of if it wasn't important? It's obviously important for them because they know with changing the words, you change ideas.
They're exerting a lot of effort and time to change it, and they're not exerting their effort on things that are unimportant. So, yes, you're absolutely right. The priest is the presider. He no longer has the role. In some cases, he no longer has the role as a priest formerly had. Yes, those words are because words carry meaning. There's the dictionary definition, but I think we all know that certain words carry meaning that is a little bit hard to put into words, but they carry meaning. So yes, that's controlling the language. You think in your language. You think yourself in English or Spanish or whatever languages you're familiar with. But when you think, you talk to yourself, and you talk to yourself in words, just the way you talk to other people.
That's right.
And if you control the language with which one person speaks to himself or one person speaks to another, you've gone a long way toward controlling what that person is able, what he's capable of thinking. And that has both an inclusionary and an exclusionary component to it. You set the tone with...
Take the word gay, for example.
Take the word gay. That's a good one.
I have some old tapes by Franz Lehar, and then he talks about the gay hussars, the happy soldiers, and now you couldn't quite use that same word, could you?
Not
get away with it?
So they take offense and will injure you.
But again, the word homosexual, sodomite, has been replaced with the term gay. It represents an ideology, not only a word. And when you use it, it's tacit to saying, yes, I accept what your interpretation of this is. And
they probably had a committee working for months to pick out which word they were going to use. And gay carries a connotation which, first of all, is inaccurate. Most homosexuals are not at all gay. They tend to be pretty unhappy people.
Yes.
Despite all the publicity telling them that they can and should feel comfortable what they're doing, most of them deep down inside don't accept it.
Have a conscience which says otherwise. Yeah.
And homophobia and others.
Yes, but one can hardly wait. I suppose they're going to come up with a sadophobia for those who have a hang-up with sadomasochism, and they'll have a pedophobia for those who have difficulties with being a pedophile. We can just look forward to this type of thing. I guess we can look forward to them to the extent that we permit ourselves to permit the opposition to have access to the brain.
And to dictate the terms we use. Sex education is not education.
That's right.
It's conditioning, and we should never use the term sex education. It's a misnomer. If they control the vocabulary, then they control the way we can think and the way we can express ideas among ourselves and to anybody. But sex conditioning, sex initiation is much more accurate, and we should insist on that. We should never use terms homophobia and gay. Homosexual is homosexual. It's not at all gay.
That's right. In fact, we're going to have to probably do some homework. I know probably all the popular movements in the United States, probably I'd say the pro-life movement is probably the most sensitive to words. I remember when I was sitting down and listening, talking about media events and access to the brain. I remember that the first speech that Bush gave, in which he talked about the New World Order. And I remember jumping halfway off my seat. The term that here he is, the president, he's saying New World Order as if it was, something everyone knew about. And someone looking across the room, I heard that. What did he say? What did he say? He said, well, he said New World Order. And, well, what does that mean? Why is that extraordinary? But anyway, so one of the things, I think, one of the weapons that we have against the controllers is the knowledge that if we can cut off his access to our mind, then we have a shot at escaping being manipulated, if not totally, at least escape a good portion of the manipulation. Do you remember one of the books on Chinese POWs pointed out that some of their survivors, in order to not be brainwashed, broke their eardrums, and in that way they were unable to hear and being unable to hear, the enemy could not have access to their brain, and therefore they were able to survive where others did not.
Yes.
And in our popular culture here, we have a number of things, TV and radio primarily, that are the constant means by which the opposition has access to our brain and to our children's brains. So I think one of the logical conclusions, and one of the very common sense conclusions, is if you don't want the enemy to have access, you have to cut off the lines of access, which would be in homes is simply to either eliminate altogether or control by other forms.
Take the networks out the word. They say, you don't want to watch our programming? Turn it off. And we should. We should say, here, you're right, and turn it off. And let the advertisers spend their money on an audience that isn't there. I thought, as a pediatrician, I'm always interested in how kids do things and how kids are like adults. And what you're talking about, international politics where one nation goes to war against another, or kids on the playground. There are certain things that are common. It's just that the kids on the playground do it on a smaller scale. But you mentioned cutting off access to your brain. Somebody says, I don't want to hear it. And I remember kids on the playground, I'm sure we've all seen this. Somebody saying, yeah, Jimmy did it. And they're teasing the kid. What's he do? He puts his hands over his ears. He said, I'm not going to listen. And the kid who wants to torment him will try to pull his hands away and be sure that he listens. And it's the same
words entering, and the child knows. Words have meaning, they're hurting him.
Girl doesn't know it, Lennon knew it, CBS knows it. It's just interesting. It's the principle stands across the board. It just gets more complicated as you get older, more sophisticated. But most kids on a playground, you'll learn a whole lot about adults in the world. I had to just sort of slip that in.
Yeah, I think most of us are shaking our heads at that one. This Dr. Day was very much into the whole population control establishment, and he was, of course, in favor of abortion. But as he again started talking about the aged and euthanasia, I recall one of the books, a population control book, saying that birth control without death control was meaningless. And one of the, if we can use the expression, one of the advantages in term is, if one was favorable toward the killing of the aged, one of the favorable things is, in fact, abortion, for the simple reason is that, universally speaking, abortion has the result of bringing about a rather inordinate chopping off of population at the front end, that is at the birth end.
Yes.
And the inevitable effect is that you will have a population which is top-heavy, within a rapidly aging population, which is the current state in the United States. So inevitably, if you are going to go about killing the young, especially at the pace we seem to have adopted ourselves to in this country, then invariably you're going to have to do something about all those aging populations, because the few children who are born, after all, they cannot be expected to carry this tremendous burden of all these people. So you're cutting one end.
That's right.
And therefore, inevitably, as you pointed out on the tape, he was saying, well, these few young people who were permitted to be born will really feel this inevitable burden on them, and so they'll be more desensitized. They'll be more warmed up to the idea of grandma and grandpa having this little party, and then shuffling off to the wherever they shuffle off to, and whether it's taking the demise pill or going to a death camp. Or
there was a movie out some years back called Soylent Green.
Oh, yes.
Do you remember Soylent?
Yes, I remember it very distinctly.
And Charlton Heston was I only saw parts of the movie. I never saw the whole thing from beginning to end. But Edward G. Robinson went to sit in the theater and he listened to Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony.
That's right.
As he was to take his demise pill.
That's right. In fact, you also made the point that, of course, the food that the people were eating were each other, right? Just and there's but that's as you said, as long as it's done with dignity and humanely, like putting away your horse, which is
it's a little bit like pornography. Years back, when kids would come across pornography, it was always poor photography and cheap paper. And Playboy came out with some glossy pages and it was really good photography. So then pornography, it's no longer cheap, it's respectable. We went to a movie at the Pittsburgh Playhouse. Took my son along. The movie was the Manchurian Candidate. But the thing...
I remember the movie.
Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Well, during the previews then of other things that were going to come, it was a movie, its title I don't remember, but it was well photographed in Technicolor with classical music in the background, and it was a pornographic movie. And I remember saying, well, if you have a guitar, then it's pornography. But if you have classical music, that converts it into art. But it was pornography. So, what, just another example of what you were saying. As long as it's done with dignity, that's what counts. So if you kill somebody with dignity, it's okay. If you have pornography with dignity, with classical music, then it's all right.
Yeah.
That was the point I was trying to...
There were, again, talking about the family. Currently, I know an awful lot of people who are out of jobs. And he had quite a bit to say about certain things like, for example, heavy industry and things like that. I guess what was the shock was that this man, I wasn't surprised that he knew a lot about population control, abortion, at the other end, euthanasia. But what did surprise me was that he was an individual who was talking about religion, law, education, sports, entertainment, food. How could one individual, and I think this is probably the question that everyone listening to these tapes is asking, how could a individual have that much input? Now, one could say, well, it didn't pan out, but we know, listening to these recollections 20 years later, I can't really, except perhaps for maybe some minor things, everything that he has said has truly come to pass, and almost beyond, beyond imagination.
Mm-hmm.
How could one individual talk with such a, authoritative, non-questioning thing that this is the way, this was going to happen, and this was going to happen in fashion, and this is what we were going to see on TV, and there were going to be, video recorders before I even ever heard of the word.
I think what happens is certainly one individual hears this, but the plans are by no means made by one or a small number of individuals. Just as industrial corporations, they'll have a board of directors with people from all sorts of activities. They sit on the board of this corporation and they say, now if we do this to our product or we expand in this area, what will that do to banking? What will that do to clothing? What will that do? What ripple effect will that have on other things? And I'm sure that whoever makes these plans, they have representatives from every area you can think of. So they'll have educators, they'll have clothing manufacturers, designers, architects,
every aspect of human endeavor,
across the board. And then when I'm sure they get together and have meetings and plan, and everybody puts in his input. Just the way a military operation goes. Mm-hmm. What will the Navy do? Will they bombard the shore? What will the Air Force do? Will they come in with air cover? What will the infantry do? It's the same thing. That these people, when they plan, they don't miss a trick. They have experts in every field. They say, now if we do this, that, and the other, John, what will that do to your operation? And John will be in a position to feedback. Well, here's what I think would happen. So it certainly covers a broad range of people, and for one individual to be able to say all of this in the 2 hours that he spoke to us really tells us that he was privy to a lot of information.
And that's right. He must have been sitting in one of those boardrooms at least some point, and I think perhaps not at the highest level from his position, but enough because anyone in the population control movement would be associated with names of foundations, powerful organizations, and
I'm sure that there's a lot that was in the plans that he never heard of. He wasn't a 4-star general in this outfit. So
that's right.
He wouldn't be on the whole story.
Well, it's too bad he couldn't talk for 6 hours instead of 2. We might have had a lot more information. There was another aspect that I found fascinating in listening to this. This whole aspect of privacy. He mentioned that as the private homes went by, we would have individuals, non-family members, perhaps sharing our apartments. As I understand, is becoming more popular out in California. Of course, California and New York being the borders, the coast states, were they? And therefore the port. That's right, port cities that bring in things so that they can eventually work their way to Middle America. And but this business about privacy, when he was talking about, for example, the area of sex, he made some strange remarks.
Is open up. But the planners won't be that open about their own lives. They'll reserve their privacy. It's for the rest of us.
Yes, just like they're listening to concerts and operas, but for the mass media, they're pumping in the hard rock and all those types of things. That was another fascinating thing. For example, and I know this has come to pass, this I deal with a lot of young people, but young people have their own radio stations for their music, and adults have their own, and never the twain shall meet.
Right.
And when they do, there's usually a clash between the old generation and the younger. And I think the same is probably true with a lot of the classical movies. And again, I can't remember when I was growing up and my dad had the radio on. I think the music was kind of a general music that, there wasn't, I didn't say to my dad, I don't like that music, turn on to another station. Whereas now there is a fabricated generational gap, which again puts the family at the disadvantage. And
it creates conflict in the family, which is one of the spin-off benefits to them. If you're constantly fussing at your kids, you don't like what they're playing, and they're focusing on you, they don't like what you're playing. That does things to the bonds of affection that you would like to be nurturing them. So they're,
yeah. And speaking of family, again, one of the things then it would appear for any resistance movement for the population controllers would probably be based on families strengthening themselves in a number of ways. One of them being to make sure that children know about grandma and grandpa and where did they come from, and developing a whole getting out the family albums and making sure that children know they have roots, first of all, and secondly, that their family is stable. One father, one mother, with children, with grandfathers, and so forth.
They're harder and harder to find.
Yeah, but those of us who have them should hold on to them. And so, toward the end of the tape, there was a reference to how, or at the time when everything would be coming together, how this New World Order would be introduced to a population which at this point, I think they would have assumed would have been more than acceptable to it. How is this put? I mean, we're just going to wake up one morning and the changes will be there, or what did he think about that?
All right. It was presented in what must be an oversimplified fashion. So with some qualifications, here's the recollection I have of it. In the winter, and there was importance to the winter, on a weekend, like on a Friday, an announcement would be made that this was in place, or about to be in place.
That the order, the new order.
The New World Order was now the system for the world. Mm-hmm. And we all owe this New World Order our allegiance. And the reason for winter is that, and this was stated, people are less prone to travel in winter, particularly if they live in an area where there's ice and snow. Summer, it's easier to get up and go. And the reason for the weekend is people who would have questions about this, Saturday and Sunday everything's closed, and they would not have an opportunity to raise questions and file a protest and say, no. And just that period of the weekend would allow a desensitizing period so that when Monday came and people had an opportunity maybe to express some reservation about it or even to oppose it, they would have had 48 hours to absorb the idea and get used to it.
Cooling off period, yeah.
Right.
Or a heating up period, depending on one's frame of mind. What about those who decided they didn't want to go along?
Somewhere in there it was that because this is a new authority, and it represents a change then from where your allegiance was presumed to be, people would be called upon to publicly acknowledge their allegiance to this new authority. And this would mean you had to sign an agreement or in some public way acknowledge that you accepted this, you offered your allegiance to this new authority, you accepted its legitimacy. And there were two impressions I carried away if you didn't. And I'm not sure whether the two impressions are necessarily mutually exclusive because this wasn't explored in great detail. One of them was that you would simply have nowhere to go. If you don't sign up, then you can't get any electric impulses in your banking account, and you won't have any electric impulses with which to pay your rent or your mortgage or your food. And when your electric impulses are gone, then you have no means of livelihood.
Could you get these things from other people, or would that be, in other words, let's say if you had a sympathetic family, I mean, what?
But no, you could not, because the housing authority would keep close tabs on who was inhabiting any domicile, any house, any apartment, any condominium, and so the housing authority would be sure that everybody who lived there was authorized to live there.
Could I get some food?
And food, your expenditures through electronic surveillance would be pretty tightly watched, so that if you were spending too much money at the supermarket, somebody would pick this up and say, how come? What are you doing all that food? You don't look that fat. You don't have that many people. We know you're not entertaining. What are you doing with all that food? And these things then would alert the...
I have 7 people in my basement who object to this New World Order, and we're feeding them. And then they said, well, one has to go. They don't belong there, and you can't feed them. And since you're sympathetic to them, maybe your allegiance isn't very trustworthy either. So, well, yeah, we see this really. I think the Chinese experience tells us a great deal about certain things. For example, when they wanted to enforce the one-child family, what did they do? Well, of course, they cut off all education for the second child. Your food rations were cut so that you couldn't get, a pregnant woman couldn't get the right amount of food. And ultimately, still, if they found ways around that, then they instituted compulsory abortion and compulsory plugging in of the IUDs and all this. And when we would somewhere in the tape this business about people can carry two conflicting ideas around, or even espouse two conflicting ideas around, as long as they don't get real close together.
Yeah.
And what immediately came to mind was, here we have an organization like Planned Parenthood, freedom to choose, yet they support population control programs, which is, of course, not the freedom to choose, and no one ever calls them to account and says, no, wait a minute now, you're freedom to choose here, but you're supporting the Chinese program, which is compulsory. And I remember a statement from the late Alan Guttmacher, one of the medical directors of Planned Parenthood, and he said, well, if people limit their families and do basically what we say, we'll fine. But if we need compulsory population control, we're going to have it. Anyway, I was just curious as to what would happen with people who wouldn't go along, and particularly that point about there wouldn't be any martyrs. And that was significant because I can recall having watched some movies about the Third Reich, that many times they would come late in the evening and people would be taken from their homes, but neighbors would never then ask, where did they go?
Mm-hmm.
They knew where they went.
Solzhenitsyn, Melissa mentions that in the Gulag Archipelago.
Does he?
Yeah.
And I think this is very similar to what we would see. People would just disappear, and you would not ask because it might endanger yourself or your family.
Yeah.
But you would know where they went.
If you ask questions, you draw attention to yourself, and then you might follow them to where they went.
That's
so
right.
Mind your own business and step over the starving man on the street who didn't go along. He didn't go into detail about precisely how this would come about, but it's not too hard to imagine. In the past, the Nazis came, the communists came in the middle of the night, and people just disappeared. And one simple way to do this is, if you're cut off from all economic support, so that you have no place to live and nowhere to eat. We already see a lot of homeless now. I just had a man in the office this morning talking about Eunice Child seeing people living in boxes downtown Pittsburgh today. These homeless guys living in boxes. Well, when the New World Order's here and you're living in a box, we can't have people littering taking trash. Yeah. So you come around with the wagon and you pick them up. The frame of mind as you're growing up and formed is that human value resides in being productive. You have to have a prestigious position, or at least perform something useful.
Make a contribution.
And the truck comes by to pick up some guy who's living in a box and he's not making any contribution. Who's going to get excited about him? He's subhuman. He's a fetus. He's a zygote. He's a derelict. Fetuses and zygotes and derelicts all are the same animal. So what do you do? Dispose of them. Who gets excited about it?
You mentioned animal. I recall that when the Chinese communists came into power, one of the first things that they taught in schools was not any thoughts about specific political ideology, but evolution, that man was just an animal.
Mm-hmm.
And if man is just an animal, then we won't mind being herds and having masters who keep tabs on the animals. And we're one big ant colony, and we've got someone to direct traffic. And and speaking of traffic, getting back to, we talked about the aged, and again, people hearing this tape, it's phenomenal how many times the things on this tape will hit you. I just came back from New Jersey, which has a lot of retirement-type villages, and I've been there over a period of years, and there's a structure around a retirement home which has been uncompleted. It has to at least be 2 or 3 years. Now, they've recently completed it. It's kind of a roadway, but I think it would be easier to get out of a complex at a playland. It is so complicated, and yet the whole region has elderly people driving, and here we are, a fairly middle-aged couple, and for the life of us, we couldn't figure out how we were going to get out, what we were going to do. And so I asked some of the residents, I said, doesn't it bother you that they haven't fixed this road for years, and now they're coming up, and this thing is so complex, you just can't go across the street, which would have been the logical thing. You have to go down, and they have a jug handle, and you have to go over and under, so it takes you so long. And the woman replied to me, well, we just don't go out. We just don't go out. So here we are, this little retirement village where they have made it very difficult for a population. Maybe there's 40 or 50, actually probably more than that, several hundred homes in this plat with only one exit. And the exit involves such a great deal of bother that they said, we try to just cut down on the numbers or the times we have to go out shopping.
Right away, it makes me wonder if it's difficult to get out, it's also difficult to get in properly for visitors.
These retirement homes kind of remind me of like an elephant burial ground. You know what I mean? But there's no, the one thing you notice is there's no children. There's not the laughter of children in these homes.
My experience has been that people in like retirement homes, nursing homes, when they see a child, they just blossom. They're really delighted to see a child. Sure, they're happy to have their sons and daughters come, other adults, but when they see a child, it doesn't even have to be their own. It just has a very beneficial effect on their mood. And if these older people aren't seeing children, the other side of that coin is the children are not seeing older people either.
That's right.
So if you don't get used to seeing older people, they don't exist.
That's right.
And I think is another interesting angle on what you said.
And that's why, again, with the family, making sure your children see their grandparents very often, no matter how much that entails. The trouble is of the logistics is certainly worthwhile, because again, if you never see someone and you don't learn to love them, and you have no contact with them, when someone says, well, it's time for your grandpap to check out, well, who's that? Who's going to defend and fight for someone that they never even saw before? I remember one of the phrases. This is, again, so many of these things. You only have to hear them once, and they stick in your mind.
Yes.
They're so jarring.
Yeah.
Was this, we've already discussed sex without reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
Then he also said the technology would be there for reproduction without sex.
Right.
And this seems to me, this is a whole nother area, because one of the, contradictory things occurring, because you would think, well, if a land is so-called overpopulated, then you would want to diminish sexual activity, or, you'd want to get rid of pornography, you want to get everything that was sexually stimulating. But no, it's just the contrary. You want to increase sexual activity, but only insofar as it doesn't lead to reproduction.
Right.
That was the message, right?
That leads, and this is my own extension, he didn't say that, but that leads to slavery, because if you become enslaved to your gratification, whether it's sex, food, or whatever, then you're more easily controlled, which is one of the reasons the celibate priesthood is so important, and so many priests don't even understand that. But if you're addicted to sex, if sex is just divorced from reproduction, sex is something that you do for gratification only. I won't try to parallel with food, because you can't go without food. Then you can be more easily controlled by the availability or the removal of the availability of sex. So that can become an enslaving feature. Now, reproduction without sex, what you would get then is a product which has all the desirable attributes of a human being without any claim to human rights. The way we do it now, you say, well, you're human because you have a father and a mother, and you have a grandfather and Uncle Fred and a family, so you're a human being, you have human rights. But if your father was a petri dish and your mother was a dust tube, how can you lay claim to human rights?
Not too much warmth there, is there?
You owe your existence to the laboratory, which conveys to you no human rights. And there's no God, so you can't go for any God-given human rights. So you're an ideal slave. You have all the attributes of a human being, but you don't have any claim on rights.
Mm-hmm. Well, in Brave New World, if you remember, they had the caste system, you know, the alphas, the omegas, and so forth.
Yeah.
And the lowest caste, well, the way they brought about the different caste systems was that in the decanting room or the birthing rooms, the individual who was to be, let's say, to do menial labor or slave labor, work in the mines, they received just a little bit of oxygen to the brain, so that they learned to love their slavery, and they were very happy because they didn't know any better. They didn't have the brains or the wherewithal to do things. But of course, the higher in the caste you got, the more oxygen was given to your brain. So we actually had a group of sub-human beings, who would be at the, as you say, slaves essentially, and. But they would love their slavery. Mm-hmm. See, in the past, slaves probably haven't loved their slavery very much. Yeah. But in this case, we have this technology which will make people love their slavery. And each caste loved being what they were in Brave New World. Yeah. And any of our listeners who hasn't read that recently, I think you read it recently again, didn't you? Yeah. Or read it for the first time?
Yeah, I read it.
It's phenomenal, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't remember... you may remember the wording of the slogan that was about the Nazi concentration camps, something about work is peace and work is happiness. I don't remember whether it was Buchenwald or Auschwitz or one of them that had this sign about it. Mm-hmm. My recollection of the words is imprecise, but the idea is what counts. And here's Huxley writing Brave New World, saying basically the same thing before Hitler even was in power.
Oh, yes.
So Huxley knew something, didn't he?
Yeah, well, of course, he came from a family that probably contributed, at least in part, to this New World Order. A number of the English authors, H.G. Wells, there are a number of books from that period, and I think also from those associations who highlighted at least concepts of what was coming down the path. And when rereading, I read Brave New World when I was in high school, and reading it 30 years later. I can remember reading it in high school. I thought, boy, is this fantasy land? Reading it 30 years later, and I said, this is scary.
This is reality.
This is too close to Yeah, and then after I thought about it, I wasn't sure whether Huxley wrote it. There seems to be some type of the similar thinking between his writings and then this talk given by Dr. Day, because you get a kind of a mixed message in Brave New World that these things are not really quite good. It would be better if man still had a sense of humor, if he still had a sense of privacy, if certain things, the family still existed. But it's inevitable. They're going to go. Too bad. I feel a little sorry about that, a little sentiment. But the new order has to come in, and we're going to have to make room for it. And I got that same impression from the things that have been said about this day take. There seemed to be he wasn't real happy about some of the things, but then, they're going to occur anyway, and make it easier on yourself. The easier more you accept it, the easier it's going to be for everyone around. And I'm kind of doing you a favor, you physicians out there this evening. I'm going to make it easier for you by telling you in advance what's coming, and you can make your own adjustments.
Somewhere in Scripture, I think it's after the flood, God said, I will write my law on men's hearts. And I feel the same parallel that you do between Dr. Day's reaction to what he was exposed to and seeming not totally accepting of this, and Huxley seeming not totally accepting of what he wrote down, but both saying, well, there's a certain inevitability to all of this, and so, let's try to talk about the best parts of it. It's going to be good for people. Technology will be better. Quality of life will be better. So you live a few years shorter. But they both do seem to send out messages of not buying the whole package. And I think
maybe wishing some people would ask more questions. This business. Well, many. Looking back over history, there are many leaders or individuals who thought, they had an idea of what a new world order should be. Certainly Hitler did, Stalin. But what was lacking during these periods is that they lacked the technology to carry many of the things out. Surveillance, constant monitoring. But in the so-called New World Order, it's going to be very difficult to escape because technology will provide those means which had been lacking those totalitarian-minded individuals from years ago, right?
I can't remember on the original tapes, did I mention the phrase where he said, "This time we're going to do it right"?
No, you didn't.
Oh, okay. There are so many details to get in, but that's... When he mentioned bringing in the New World Order, he said, "This time we're going to do it right." And right away I'm wondering...
What do you mean, this time?
What do you mean, this time?
Have we done it before? What?
And there's no explicit explanation of that, but I think it's fairly easy to infer that previous efforts had to do with the Third Reich and communism and...
everything going back to the French Revolution, I would say. So,
and your point about the technology is critical with computers and all means of exchange being controlled by electronic impulses. Nobody has any wealth. You own nothing of value except access to electronic impulses, which are beyond your own control.
A cashless society?
A cashless society. So when your reward for working is so many impulses on the computer, and then you go to checkout or the furniture store or clothing store and you buy, and you in exchange you give so many electronic impulses. The only claim you have is to these impulses, and the people that run the system can give or take them as they choose. Up until this time, there was no way the statement in the book of Revelation that said, "No man can buy or sell unless he has a market of the beast." There's no way that could be enforced. People say, "Hey, I'll trade a bushel of tomatoes for a bushel of wheat. If you ride my kids to school, I'll give you 6 ears of corn."
Mm-hmm.
Or
bartering, right.
And even not going necessarily to that, maybe there's always gold and silver and other forms of money that were even better than bartering. But with this cashless society, this is the first time, I believe, in the history of the human race where the entire population of the world can be controlled economically so that somebody can say, "I know I'm pushing the right buttons, I know how much credit you have electronically, I know where you spend your money electronically, and you cannot buy, you cannot sell unless you get on my computer." Right now you have a half a dozen credit cards in your pocket, but pretty soon they'll be narrowed into one credit card, and then when the ostensible reason is people lose their credit cards, and we have to get rid of that and put the implant in.
That's right. And where can you put the implant? On your hand or on your forehead?
Where it has to be accessible to the skin. So your right hand to your forehead.
Speaking of scanner, when we had the TV war, the Gulf War, and the first war, you just sit there and 24 hours a day, just like being on the battlefield there. But there was several points made about the advances in technology and how they could spot just one little individual down in they could they used the constant reference to pinpoint. You could pinpoint. Well, I imagine that with these the different technologies, they could also pinpoint a couple of renegades in the New World Order. I mean, what was the technology which was applicable to a so-called enemy can also be applicable to this controlling the order, with.
Exactly, it's infrared stuff that is, I'm sort of amateurish about this, but any heat source, like a deer or a human being, a renegade, can be picked up by an infrared scanner, and you get sort of an outline of whether it's a deer or a sheep or whatever. My first hearing about them was in the Vietnam War, where our troops used them to detect the enemy. Now that's 20-some years ago, so they're probably even more sophisticated now than they were then. But with this kind of surveillance, it'd be pretty hard for anybody to escape and say, well, I'm just going to go off into the mountains and be a hermit and escape the New World Order. I can shoot deer and eat berries and survive. And I've got a wife who's pretty sturdy, and she'll be able to survive, and we'll do what the Indians did before Columbus got here, and we'll all survive. The New World Order say, no, you won't, because we're going to find you.
Yeah, well, even in Brave New World, they had a group of people who still lived as a family, and the women breastfed, and of course they were called the savages.
Yeah.
Remember those?
Yeah.
But we won't have any savages. We'll cultured, we'll be thin, and our teeth will be straight.
And something also that was mentioned, forests could, and if necessary, would be leveled or burned. Now this comes out of this overall movement about Goddess Mother Earth and how we have to protect the ecology.
Oh, yes, the environmental movement, right.
But the environmental
ostensible movement.
This stuff's all expensive. If we want to get somebody who's trying to get away, we'll burn down the whole forest, we'll find them. That was stated, that deforestation would and could be brought about if necessary to be sure that nobody gets outside the control of the system.
Well, we're just about drawing to a close here. How did you feel after, well, let's say it's been about, 22 years now since that original lecture, and it probably isn't a day that goes by, at least since I've heard the tapes, that I don't think about the things that this Dr. Day said.
You get constant reminders. Not a day goes by. Something doesn't say, that reminds me of such and such, whether it's surveillance or security, somebody selling a security system to keep your house from being burned.
Or clothing. Or I opened up a toy catalog the other day, and I noticed that there didn't happen to be any baby dolls in the toy catalog. Of course, going back to the idea we don't want little girls to be thinking about babies. They only had one little doll, and it was kind of an adult doll, and nothing that would raise anyone's maternal instinct there. Well, Doc, what's the prognosis?
Well, left to man alone, I think the technology is already here, and with technological progress, I think it is inevitable, if man is left to his own devices, that some men will be able to assert total control over other men, or other people. Man left to his own devices, the tendency is in groups like this then for internal dissension to arise, where the leaders would be at each other's throats too, each saying, no, I'm more powerful than you, I deserve more than you.
Who will control the controllers?
Yeah, they would battle themselves, I think, so that they would create the seeds of their own destruction while they're creating the system. But the other thing, I wonder if indeed this may be time for a Lord to come back and say enough's enough. Because you're going to destroy my planet Earth, and I am in charge of the planet. I'm in charge of mankind. Mankind will be destroyed or whatever if I say. I will not allow my creatures to assume and assert this degree of control where you're going to destroy the whole planet.
I was thinking, as you was just saying that, is that in past, dictators could kill people, they could torture them, but essentially they could not change what it meant to be a human being. They could not change human nature.
Yeah.
now we are going to have, with this, the new genome project, the multi-billion-dollar project, where they're going to be getting a tab on everyone's genes. No one shall escape. Everyone shall have their genetic codes and all this. And with this opens the door to manipulation, to change the very meaning of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
And one then, if one has an entity then that no longer has free will, you just have to wonder, at that point, our Lord says, enough.
Just as Lucifer set himself up as God in the beginning, some people now would set themselves up as God and say, I control the computers, I control the genomes, I control everything. I am God. And at that point, then he would have to say, no, you're not. I have to demonstrate to you, you're not. I'm still God. You're just a creature.
Yeah. And as you said on the original tape, we believe in what our Lord has said, in the sense that he will not leave us orphans, that he will be with us to the end of time.
This right away now begs the question when they come around and say, it's your turn to sign the allegiance form. What are you going to do? When Henry VIII came around and he said, well, you either sign here and join, or, and while he's telling you this, they're throwing the noose over the limb of the oak tree and saying, slipping the noose around your neck and saying, you want to sign this, or do we slap the horse out from under you? And a lot of people said, I won't sign it, and they were martyred. Despite his having said there will be no martyrs, certainly there will be martyrs. And the implication in his statement was, well, they will not be recognized as martyrs. But there will be martyrs, and they will be recognized as martyrs. And maybe not in the same way as in the past, but I think this is something that maybe all people need to sort of prepare themselves for. When I'm nose to nose with this choice, are you going to sign this allegiance or not, or we're going to put you in a boxcar and you're going out to Arizona, to the desert. People have to be prepared to make a decision.
And I think it would be an understatement not to say, or to say, that this tape has great meaning, and it's just like a forewarning, and it gives us ideas of things we should do and things we shouldn't do. And I think everyone listening to the tape will come up with different things that he can do on a small scale. I think that's the beauty of this thing. It's not, as he was talking, it wasn't like real earth-shattering things that he was talking about. He was talking about little things, television, things that we do every day, things that are under our control, the books we read, and I think probably some of these changes, if they're going to occur, will occur with the individual person within that family, with him getting the word out, and then doing the little things. I think they matter over the long haul the most.
Just as with the prisoners who survived the brainwashing, I think people who are spiritually oriented, who are thinking about God, thinking about their relationship with God, are the ones who will then be better prepared, very equipped to survive this world and the next. Whereas those who are just focused on meeting their needs right now, strictly the material needs of the day, they're more easily controlled. Under the threat of losing your comfort, or losing your food, or losing your head, or whatever, certainly some people are going to yield, and those who I think will survive, and I really mean in both this life and the next, they're going to be the ones who are going to have to be prepared, because it's my belief, when the time comes to make the decision, you're going to sign on it, or you're not going to sign on it. It's too late to begin the preparation and start saying, well, let me think about it. You won't have time to think about it. You're going to either say yes or no. I hope a lot of us make the right decision.
I do so too, and I think the tape will change as many lives and have hopefully as good an effect as it had on mine and on yours. So let me thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
For further information, please contact the U.S. Coalition for Life
Box 315, Export, Pennsylvania 15632. Your comments and criticisms and any other information which you might have regarding this tape will be most welcome.